Jon Prosser shares more renders of how iOS 19 could look, and breaking news, guys, brace yourselves, there are rounder icons. Wow! Let's delve into this very exciting news. So earlier, Jon Prosser showed us other elements of iOS 19, like the redesigned camera UI, the new lock screen where the notifications are more translucent, and there's a new 3D floating look for the toggles, settings and pop-ups with a more glassy aesthetic imitating Vision OS, and a redesigned keyboard where it almost creates this illusion of it floating. But I'll be honest, I was still expecting a little more, and thankfully Jon Prosser now shares more renders that show us more drastic changes. And namely, we see circular icons in these new renders, which have been taken directly from Vision OS. Jon Prosser had actually first told us in the builds he saw he couldn't see evidence of rounder icons. However, it seems Apple's hiding this element because in current builds, if you long press on a circle icon, it then becomes rounder after a brief animation. Maybe Apple's hiding these new icons in builds to prevent leaks, but clearly their plan did not work because it's leaked, and so Tim's now very angry. But I like the look of this. Yes, it's just different shaped icons and it doesn't functionally add anything whatsoever, but hey, who cares when it's circular? I'm always down for visual refreshes that are executed well, and this looks clean in my opinion. Apple could of course give consumers a choice, and similar to Android devices, it would be nice if you could switch between squircle and circular icons, but this is Apple we're talking about. They don't give consumers a choice, they want design consistency, and so I'm expecting everyone to be forced to use these new icons whether you like it or not. But personally, I'm not against that because these icons are very cool. Another UI change to expect is a pill-shaped tab bar at the bottom of many Apple's first-party applications. You can see how it looks, and it seems Apple is going to prioritize putting a lot of tabs towards the bottom of the device, which is great for reachability, especially for those using the Pro Max and having to do hand gymnastics right now to reach some areas of the UI. Also, Apple is rounding off everything, and I mean everything. So if you long press on an app, the menu that pops up is rounder now, there's new sliders for volume and brightness in the control center, and the settings app now has cinema toggles. There's also a subtle lighting effect to some elements that help create this glass-like appearance. So for example, the flashlight and camera controls on the lock screen shimmer as you move the iPhone, which sounds pretty cool. You know what else would be cool, guys? Clicking that subscribe button, of course. It's free and would bring you the latest about Apple right to subscription box, so please consider it. It would be appreciated. Join the Saranbyte gang now. So overall, I actually love the look of this. Yes, I'm an Apple sheep who's quite easily impressed by new fancy icons, but iOS has looked the same for a while, and so I'm glad to see a visual overhaul that's going to make your iPhone feel fresh. And I know some may argue that we don't need a redesign to iOS, we need stability. In fact, I have a feeling Apple's giving us this major redesign to distract us from the fact Apple Intelligent Siri features have been delayed. And honestly, it's a good distraction, because whilst AI features in iOS may eventually get useful, they certainly aren't a must-have feature right now, whereas design changes to the UI is something you would appreciate every single day. My only concern is bugs. I really hope it's not too buggy, but if Apple's changing so much with iOS 19, you just know those first few betas are going to be rough. Hopefully the public builds are stable though, but knowing Apple's software quality as of late, I may be asking too much from them. Now, by the way, it's not just Prosser claiming there's going to be a redesign, we've had other leakers chiming in as well. Last year, the Verify actually had first mentioned this, but they claimed this would come to iOS 18, which is wrong of course. Then Jon started talking about a possible redesign this year, and finally Mark Gurman's also chiming in, suggesting the same, having said Apple's goal is to make Apple's various software platforms more consistent in design. And so these design changes will apply to both iPadOS and macOS too. That's good because it is odd that we got the Big Sur redesign in 2020 for macOS, but those redesigned icons never came to the iPhone or the iPads. And so I'm hoping all platforms are based on Vision OS and we have the same general look for all devices. And Gurman also kept emphasizing that Apple plans to change everything. The style of icons, menus, apps, windows, system buttons. The company's also going to simplify the way users navigate and control their devices. The changes go well beyond a new design language and aesthetic tweaks according to Gurman, but unlike Prosser, he didn't show us anything specific. I do want to mention though, Gurman has doubts over Prosser's leaks, but what they both say does actually line up for the most part. The only aspects we've yet to see are the ways functionality of the UI could change. The renders Jon Prosser showed us are mostly aesthetic changes, but with such a big redesign, I'm sure there's going to be some functionality changes that hopefully don't balk our devices. Now let's move on to devices that'll be running iOS 19 and iPadOS 19, and unfortunately there's bad news, guys. So because iOS 19 is going to be such a substantial update, Apple does apparently plan to drop the iPhone XS, XS Max, and XR according to a credible anonymous source. These devices were released back in 2018, so they've already had 6 years of updates, and so I'm not too surprised by this news. The XR especially only had 3 gigs of RAM, so for those still using these devices, just be aware your device may lose support soon. Now obviously these devices not getting iOS 19 does not suddenly make them unusable. Apple still releases security updates for older iOS versions, and so you could theoretically keep using them for a little longer, but eventually apps are going to stop supporting iOS 18, and also you'll be missing out on your features you would want to try out. Now moving to iPadOS 19, Apple plans to only drop the iPad 7th generation, which has the A10 Fusion from 2016. That's a crazy old chipset, but what's funny is that the iPad 8th generation, which has the A12 that Apple's dropping from the iPhone range, is still going to be supported. This has already happened in the past because the iPhone 7, which had the A10, did not get iOS 16, whereas the iPad 7 with the same A10 got iPadOS 16, 17, and 18, so it seems Apple's happy supporting these iPads for longer because they did launch a couple of years after these iPhones. Does that mean theoretically the iPhone XR and XS could run iOS 19 if the iPad 8 generation is also getting iPadOS 19? Maybe, but the iPad 7 generation was very sluggish on iPadOS 18, and so there's a possibility the iPad 8 generation also suffers on iPadOS 19. We will have to wait and see. And let's now talk about the brand new phones which will run iOS 19 out of the box, which are the iPhone 17s. So recently we got new models from YouTuber iDevice Help showing us the new camera modules on the Pro phones, and it's certainly an interesting look. Leakers have been going back and forth on the new camera module we could see with iPhone 17 Pro. For those unaware, initially we were expecting a new horizontal layout similar to the Pixel, which would give this phone a completely fresh look and would make it stand out compared to every other iPhone since the 11 Pro, which has had the same stove design layout. However, there is a reason Apple's firmly stuck to this design, and it's not because they're lazy, it's because the lenses are at equal distance from each other, which allows for seamless switching between the lenses, but also the positioning of the camera now helps the iPhone record spatial video, and so moving the lenses around could break these aspects of the camera experience, hence why other leakers have been suggesting the stove design is going to remain, but Apple's instead going to incorporate a part glass, part aluminium design. And that's what we see in these new models. There's the familiar triple lens layout, but the LiDAR scanner, mic and flash have moved to the right sides, and we have this aluminium camera bar at the top now, and a glass portion below it. I guess Apple using a mix of aluminium and glass will make this iPhone similar to the iPhone 5 in this aspect. Now, as much as I do like that Apple's changing things up visually with the iPhone, this is not a revolutionary redesign and reminds me of Poco phones if anything, but we will have to see the real deal before we can properly judge this. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments, make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and thank you for watching.